Today we have Morgan here with us, Morgan Bryant, and she is a professor and really focusing on consumerism. And there's a lot of information that I'd love to get out of you. Welcome, Morgan. How are you?
I'm doing well, Hayden. Thank you for having me. I'm excited for this opportunity.
Yeah, I really think that our students are going to get a lot out of what you have to say. So, can you give us a little bit of a background and how you came to where you are right now?
Absolutely. So it was less of a direct route. A lot of folks who come into academia usually know at some point in their college experience, figure out that that's something that they want, and they go straight through. So they do undergrad, they might do a master's program that leads into a PhD program. And my program was a little more roundabout. So I did figure out in undergrad that being a professor was something that I wanted to consider as a future or long term career option. But as a business student and having come into contact with business professors in my undergraduate experience, one of the things that was really important to me was having some industry experience to bring into the classroom when I became a professor. And so I decided I didn't want to go that direct route, that I wanted to go out into industry and work for a while. And so that's exactly what I did. When I finished my master's degree, I went out and worked. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry primarily. I started my career working in the finance sector. Transitioned into marketing. I realized that while I was really good with numbers and Excel and analytics, that I actually really liked people, and people really don't come around the finance and accounting departments. And so I tried to find ways to transition over to marketing because that seemed to be where all the people were and where you got a whole lot more people interaction. And so I transitioned into doing a lot of analytics and consumer research, and some competitive analysis, a lot of things around dealing with consumers and products. And so that's where I spent the bulk of my career once I figured that out and made that transition. And it's from working in that space that I finally made the decision, okay, now's the time. I'm ready to make my transition. And so I actually had to step out of corporate America, go back to school full time for a few years, which is a really different transition to make, particularly as an older student. It brought with it a bunch of very different experiences for me. And then I came out of a PhD program and into teaching. So I actually started as an instructor while I was still finishing my PhD, and it was my work experience that really made that possible. So instead of being a teaching assistant, I was given full classes to develop and deliver because I had industry experience that aligned with the coursework, which gave me a big leg up when I went into the job market looking for an academic placement as a professor, because now I not only had professional experience, I not only had an academic degree, but I had already been in charge of curriculum development, course
Right,
design,
right.
course delivery, which really benefited me well. So it was a really nice alignment of how things came sort of, I couldn't have planned it better, but they came together. And that's kind of how I ended up where I am now. So just made some transitions, took advantage of opportunities as they made themselves available.
So I want to step back for just a second. We have a large population of alternative students, and even that term is sometimes pejorative. But students who don't fit in from the 18 to 22 age range or have come back, we have a large veterans population. And so they've lived life, so to speak, and are now sitting in classrooms, sometimes with people who are 7, 8, 9 years their junior. How did you navigate those waters going back to school?
Yeah, so it was a little different for me because I was going back in graduate school. So graduate students tend to be a little older than your typical undergraduates, even if they've gone all the way through. You typically find a lot of the PhD students tend to be in their earlier 20s, maybe in their mid 20s, which is exactly what I found myself in the middle of. And I was much younger, or I'm sorry, much older than the majority of my classmates. And in some cases, I was older than or contemporaries of most of our professors. And so, most of my I mean, I could probably name two or three classes where I know that I had several years on the professor who was teaching me and teaching my classmates. And so, at first, it got to me a little bit. Until I realized that everybody's experiences are different, everybody's perspective is different. I was still able to find a place, find community with my classmates, even though they were younger. And what I found is some of the things that they were really good at because they had been in school more recently than me and kind of been in school under the current technological environment. I mean, I can remember, doing things using a card catalog. Like I'm really good at that, but
Yeah.
that's not really what
Those were the days.
current. We had catalogs at our university library. They were purely for show. There was literally nothing inside of them, so I couldn't leverage that understanding or that skill set. What I had that they didn't have was life experience. I had lived life. I had held jobs. Like there were certain things about my ability to put structure around my academic experience that my classmates just didn't have. They didn't have the same life experience, so they would freak out if something wasn't going exactly the way that the instructions suggested that it might, or if it didn't look exactly the way that the screenshot said that it might, or if they called and something wasn't readily available or something. Whereas for me, I had encountered thousands of those types of instances. I could figure things out. I would source information, source resources. And so I really found ultimately, while they might be more well versed on some content, I was far more well versed on just knowing how to get things done, knowing how to approach things. And so I ended up leveraging that, right? So I could help them get through some things, and they would kind of teach me how to use or navigate certain things that were just very different from the last time I had been in a college setting, in a learning setting. So I had to find ways to leverage it. And sometimes it was just teaching them some of my old references, right? I'd make a joke and they'd be looking and be like, we don't know what that is. I'm like, you don't remember that? And then I realized, so that commercial or that
Right.
reference that I'm making is from 94. She was born in 98, 96. Like she literally has no idea what I'm talking about. So
Right. That's a skill that you ended up will probably have to use with your classrooms. The students have no idea what we're talking about sometimes.
absolutely. And I think it's hilarious. And they're just like, yeah, okay.
So once again, we're here talking with Morgan Bryant, and one of the really interesting thing, I'm looking at your list of accomplishments and looking at some of the stuff that you've presented, and so consumerism as a topic matter, for me it feels like there's a lot that can be put in there. This is a very a society based on consumerism. Like we buy and consume a lot of stuff. And I really enjoyed just reading the titles of some of the stuff. An award tour, applied analytics, a review of mainstream consumption of urban music concerts. And then Olivia Pope's Wine Glass, fan communities and impact of parasocial relationships on consumption. Like I love your titles. I'm just going to go ahead and start there. But what's your take on consumerism? How do you? I guess what is your focus on in terms of teaching consumerism? Sorry, that was a
So
convoluted question.
no. So I understand what you're getting at. So I can approach that a couple of ways. So kind of the way that I teach from is I consider myself to be an applied instructor. So I like to use a lot of real world examples because I teach in marketing, because I teach some of the quantitative marketing. I tend to teach marketing research, marketing analytics, and people are often shy from numbers or calculation. People say, "Oh, I don't do math." Well, that's great. This isn't a math class, right? But because people come in with those apprehensions, I like to use that applied part to put some of the concepts and techniques that we're going to be learning in terms of things that they know and understand that make it a little more comfortable, a little easier for them to kind of roll up their sleeves and get into it. And one of the things that we all kind of have experience with is consumption. And
Right.
so that dovetails very nicely into what I like to research. So some of those titles you were just reading were off of some of the current projects that I have looking at research. So Consumerism shows up a lot of different ways. Where I tend to focus on consumerism is I look at a very specific space called social commerce. And that social commerce looks at the intersection of using social media and online social networking platforms or functionality that simulates social networking platforms
Right.
to influence consumption and shopping, whether that shopping happens online as well. So think of an Etsy or an Amazon, or whether that influences someone to walk into a traditional brick and mortar store
And
and
get a
buy
bottle of
something.
wine.
Exactly. So the title that you referenced, the Olivia Pope, that particular paper, that research project is looking at something that's a very well established concept in marketing, which is this concept of the consumer journey. So we as consumers, we have this journey where something draws our attention to say, hey, I need or want X, whether that's something like these days, like toilet paper, right?
Right.
Or whether that's something like a wine glass. Okay. So you have something that triggers this desire of want or need. Then, as a consumer, we go out and we're trying to collect information. Well, what are the options for getting toilet paper or wine glasses? Who sells them? At what price points? What's the preferred toilet paper option? What's the preferred wine glass? There's all sorts of stuff. So we collect all this information and we come up with a choice set. And then we're trying to decide amongst those options. We make our ultimate choice, and then, okay, so maybe we've decided what we want. Now we have to decide where we want to get it, who's going to be the best outlet, the store. Am I getting Walmart wine glasses, or am I getting, Williams and Sonoma wine glasses, right? And then once we buy whatever we're buying, we have the final step in the consumer journey is this post purchase activity. That's where we kind of talk about it,
Right.
and we
Okay.
evaluate how we feel about the purchase decision that we've made. And often when we think about evaluating that, we also share our experience, good or bad or indifferent. And so that's typically known as word of mouth. So we'll tell somebody, you typically tell, two people when you've had a good experience, you tell 10 when you've had a bad experience. Well,
Right.
social media amplifies that entire journey. And so the Olivia Pope research paper is looking at, if I look at Twitter specifically, when the show was still on the air, if you watch the show, they kind of called fans gladiators, and they were one of the first shows to really, really nail what they call second screening, which is using devices to engage online in real time while the show is on. But Scandal was really good at keeping that engagement and conversation going, even if it's not the night that the TV show is on, even if it's in between seasons, the show's on hiatus, there's still lots of conversation happening. And a lot of it had to do with fans really liked the image of the main character, Olivia Pope. And so they identified with that. They aspired to be
Right.
like her. And so the way that they could try to be like her is to have the things that she has. And so she was really well known for her wardrobe and accessories, but also for drinking wine. She had very distinctive wine glasses
Right.
that were used that ended up being a fan figured out that those wine glasses, which were purely from the prop department, not at all a product placement, were from Crate and Barrel. And so that fan base started talking about that in Twitter using all of the show affiliated hashtags. And so my research follows the conversation by following the hashtags over a period of time from when someone announced what these wine glasses were until fans of the show started figuring that out, and then they started buying it. And we could see that the product became one of the top selling products for Crate and Barrel simply because of its association with the character Olivia Pope and the conversation that was happening about the product and the character in social media, particularly in Twitter in this particular paper.
That's
So
crazy. And that's probably completely unintended advertising.
very much so. And so my research is looking at that. So companies pay thousands of dollars, in some
Right.
cases millions of dollars, to have product placement. And here was one where not only did they not pay, it's a clear glass. There's no logo, there's no branding, there's no coloring, but fans figured it out. And then the stickiness of their desire to be like the main character was so strong that it drove lots of fans through that consumer journey funnel into this particular product. And then they talked about it a lot on the Crate and Barrel website. So their reviews were so positive, so high, and so strong that that had a halo effect and carried over even for people who may not be fans or even watched or had heard of the show. As they were going through their own respective consumer journey and looking for information about wine glasses that they might want to purchase, they
Right.
see all this positive conversation happening around this particular brand, this particular model of wine glass. And so then they too went through and chose it as one of their options in their decision set.
Wow.
So that's kind of one example of how I look at it. But what's really interesting about that type of research is you can apply that in so many different ways. So that's a fun one because it's a TV show that a lot of people know and are familiar with. It's wine, it's Twitter, right? But I've also used that same approach in looking at real estate listings. So if you
Mm,
look online
yeah.
in places like Zillow, and you can start to see how certain words and conversations um, are pushing through on neighborhoods and listings, making reference to certain things. And I've got research that looks at how does that ultimately impact real estate prices in that neighborhood.
Correct.
Because the conversation has the same thing. Now people desire to consider homes in that area. You start to see lots of listings start to use the same language because
Mm,
they're trying to be aligned to that. And so it puts a consumerism, sort of almost a branding effect to certain
yeah.
neighborhoods and neighborhood features in real estate. And then ultimately, I like music. So that's where the other one, the award tour, is really
Right. Right.
looking at similar effects in consuming concerts.
So the interesting thing is that, and this, the last question that I'm going to ask you is that the Multicultural Center's main focus is looking at everybody's identity and how it plays into all of the different ways that they walk through this world. Um, uh, you know, how have your identities, whether it is the ones that are salient to you or sometimes even subconscious to you, played into what you decide to research?
They are a primary factor in what I research, what I teach, what examples that I use. As a Black woman, I am often in spaces in my own classrooms where I'm the only person of color in the room. And so I recognize that I've got a couple different roles to play
Hmm.
in that case. I'm one of few women. I'm one of few people of color, let alone women of color, that exist in my building, right? And so what I know is my students are going to leave campus and move out into environments where they're extremely diverse. They look like the world that we live in, but campus may not always be as reflective of that. And so part of my job is to make sure that they are given opportunities to learn, understand, consume, ask questions, and just overall be exposed to what it's like when you step out and take a job, when you move into
Hmm.
industry. And so, because of that, I bring lots of multicultural examples into the classroom. I bring lots of that into what I research. Most of my research centers around things that look at people of color, primarily
Hmm.
Black people. So, looking at a product, that example with Olivia Pope, well, that's a TV show, a primetime television show that had a multicultural cast where the lead was a Black woman,
Right.
which was of importance to me. The example I gave you with real estate, I did that looking at a predominantly African American or historically predominantly African American neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia,
Yeah.
particularly the neighborhood where Martin Luther King was born and grew up, and how I'm looking at how one piece of online activity really added a consumerism lens and
The
helped usher in
demographics.
gentrification in
Yeah.
that neighborhood. On my music papers, I'm looking at how hip hop has become mainstream. So, to your point, a lot of things around consumerism have to do with how we identify, and particularly with cultural products like music, we tend to consume those things that speak to us culturally And so that particular paper is looking at, if you take two locations that are similar, one has a predominantly African American population, one has a predominantly white
Hmm.
population, and you look at the consumption of urban or hip hop concerts, what's driving it when you see just as much, if not more, consumption in the white environment, knowing that from a cultural consumption perspective, white consumers don't have the same cultural competencies, the same cultural identification, points of identification. So, what's driving the change in consumption when it's not the cultural identity part, which to me is a really interesting thing to look into and unpack. So, to
Right,
your
right,
point, it drives much of what I decide to research, the kind of data I try to collect and uncover, the examples, experiences, and guest speakers that I bring into my classroom for my students. For my white students, I think it gives them a level of exposure that they're not going to get in other classes. And for my students of color, I think it gives them an opportunity to feel reflected in the images and the content that they see, if only for one class a
right.
day, right?
To
So,
be seen, to be included.
absolutely.
Awesome. This has been an excellent conversation, and I guarantee you I could probably do this for another hour or so. But I know you're a busy woman, so I want to thank you so much for your time. And anytime you feel like coming up to Manhattan College and guest lecturing at one of our events, we'd love to have you. Thank you so much, Morgan.
Oh, this was so much fun. I really appreciate being considered, and I would love to come up and do something like that. Please keep me posted when our respective campuses reopen.
Yes, absolutely. When we get done dealing with this crisis. So again, this has been Morgan Bryant, and this is Hayden Green from the Multicultural Center. And hopefully, you have enjoyed this. And tune in next week for another interesting presentation on our Tiny Talk series. Thank you so much, Morgan. Have a good day.
You too.